Jaisley Beck was a proud soldier. The teenager's much-loved job was to encourage others to have a life in the army. But it is in her death severe concerns over safeguarding have emerged. At just 19, Jaisley was the victim of sustained sexual harassment by her line manager and later sexually assaulted by a senior serviceman. Today, the inquest into Jaisley's death found the Army's failure to investigate her complaints was partially responsible for her suicide.
I believe it was a cover-up, and it's been made clear through the findings that the Army have failed our daughter Jaisley.
This is where Jaisley's body had been found on the 15th of December 2021 at Lark Hill Camp in Wiltshire. The inquest heard how a culture of alcoholism and blurred lines between senior officers and their subordinates led to a misuse of power. Jaisley had been aggressively pursued by her line manager. Bombardier Ryan Mason had sent Jaisley more than 4,500 messages in which he professed his love, expressed jealousy, and threatened to harm himself, mounting pressure on the teenager. In one reply, Jaisley called Mason possessive and psychotic. The court heard how after Mason had engineered for him and Jaisley to have adjoining rooms on a work event, Jaisley had told Mason, "You have to understand, this is not normal behaviour. I feel so uncomfortable on this event. I've literally cried about it and been worrying about it. The truth is I'm struggling to deal with all of this. It's taking a toll on my own mental health." Earlier that year at an activity week, Jaisley had told her family that Battery Sergeant Major Michael Webber had pinned her, tried to kiss her and touched her between the legs. When Jaisley informed her superiors, instead of reporting the incident to the police, the man accused was allowed to write an apology instead. The court heard how this sexual assault on a teenager by a middle-aged man of senior rank was officially recorded as merely inappropriate behaviour. The coroner said that the decision not to report the alleged sexual assault to the police was part of a systemic failure that tried to achieve the least punitive outcome for the accused serviceman. We now know that was a contributing factor to Jaisley's death and raises serious concerns over how the Army handles complaints over sexual harassment and bullying. The same year Jaisley took her life, a landmark report by the Defence Committee found servicewomen were over 10 times as likely as servicemen to experience sexual harassment. And 60% of serving female officers had been subject to bullying, harassment or discrimination. Of these, 2/3 did not report their experiences. Jaisley's story follows several high-profile cases. In 2011, Corporal Anne-Marie Element took her own life after military investigators opted not to prosecute 2 soldiers accused of raping her. And in 2019, an inquest found that the Army missed chances to prevent the suicide of Officer Cadet Olivia Perks. But the Army say things have changed.
The 3 years since Jaisley's sad death have seen significant changes in the Army, including the introduction of clear and unequivocal policies to state that there will be zero tolerance to unacceptable sexual behaviours.
But what does this mean for who investigates the allegations? Jaisley's family are calling on that power to be taken away from the Army as more cases emerge.
The only comfort we now know is knowing that hundreds of people in the military have come forward, sharing their own experiences and seeking support. No one should ever have to suffer in silence.
The Army called Jaisley Beck the kind of soldier they need. Yet today's inquest found systemic failings partly responsible for her absence. An institution supposed to protect us has failed to protect a young woman in its own ranks.
Well, I'm joined now by Mariette Hughes, who is the Complaints Ombudsman for the Armed Forces and who oversees the complaints process for men and women in the UK's military, and Emma Norton, who's solicitor for Jaisley Beck's family, and she's also set up the Centre for Military Justice. Emma Norton first, how widespread within the forces do you think is the kind of sexual assault and harassment that Jaisley experienced?
Good evening. I think it's pretty widespread. We know that almost 90% of people in the armed forces that experience bullying, harassment or discrimination don't even make a complaint about it. it is a real hidden, it's a terrible, terrible thing. And the kinds of experiences that Jaisley was describing to her family are unfortunately incredibly familiar to us at the Centre for Military Justice. A culture of disbelief, constantly being told, think of the impact on him if you go ahead and make this complaint. A widespread ignorance amongst the chain of command as to how they're supposed to support women who report sexual assaults, and all sorts of problems with military policing. So I'm afraid the kinds of experiences, the clients that contact us, thankfully, they don't usually lead to this kind of catastrophic outcome, but they are all too familiar. And lots of the women that come to us for help describe feeling completely despondent, completely overwhelmed at a process which they have no faith in because it completely lacks independence.
Well, I'll come back to that in just a second. But Marietta Hughes, do you endorse that this kind of behaviour in the army, this treatment of women, is pretty widespread? When you look at all the complaints that have been coming out on social media anonymously, that does suggest it's pretty prevalent, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We do know that a number of people report that they've been subject to behaviour such as bullying, harassment and discrimination. The Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Survey tells us it's as much as 12% in the last 12 months. And as Emma has mentioned, only 1 in 8 of those individuals go on to raise a complaint. What we're seeing, particularly now in the outpouring on social media of individuals sharing their stories, is that historically the scale and breadth of this issue has widely been misunderstood.
Well, Emma, you talked about, how complaints are handled. Does the army now, has it lost the right to adjudicate these complaints itself? Should there be an external body handling all these complaints now, in your view?
Absolutely, there should be. And this has been being called for years now. So in 2019, there was an independent review by Air Chief Marshal Michael Wigston. He recommended the creation of what he called a central defence authority that would sit outside of the single services. So we're not saying it's got to be completely ex-MOD at this stage, just outside the single services would be something. And that would have a number of functions, but one of the things it would do, it would take the most serious complaints. So we're not saying all of them, but the most serious ones that the kind of complaint that Jaisley should have brought if she'd had the confidence and the support to do so. They should be taken away from the single services themselves because they unfortunately have shown that they cannot be trusted to deal with them themselves. They will tell you that they have brought in all of these changes. There are some changes, but they are often massively overstated in the extent of those changes. They are presented as independent when they are not. All they've done is remove the chain of command from some of those investigations. That is not independent.
Well,
it needs to be.
They also say they've introduced anonymous hotlines. Is that progress?
They've always had an anonymous hotline. For many, many years, they had it in the army. All they did in 2022 was extend it to the other services. So again, that's another nice smoke and mirrors point. And the problem with the hotline is it doesn't refer you externally. It just refers you back in to the chain of command. It tells you about how to make a service complaint. It doesn't get you outside of the services.
Mariette, do you agree that the time is now for an independent, in some capacity, as Emma has just described, way of handling these complaints?
It's a difficult one for me, and it is a decision for the Ministry of Defence to make. Primarily, I do believe that service complaints themselves should be handled internally by the services. The service complaint system is a replacement for a workplace grievance system, and as with any employer, you would want your employer to be able to see what's gone wrong and show dedication and commitment to fixing that themselves. Haven't they
lost the right to do that by the way they've handled this complaint and others, and the fact that women don't have confidence in coming forward and making these complaints?
I think the issue with previous complaints is that people don't have that confidence to come forward, and as has been alluded to, there have been a number of very positive changes that mean individuals can submit their complaints outside of the chain of command and directly to a centralised admissibility service. My key concern is the individuals who still don't feel able to speak up, because regardless of who is investigating the complaint, there is still a very real fear that however that complaint is investigated, it will get back to the unit, that people will be marked out as being troublemakers for having had that courage to speak up.
Right, but you don't think there should be a kind of independent body handling this. Emma, what's your response to that?
It's incredibly disappointing. It's incredibly disappointing because what happens is what happened to Jaisley. The pressure is on them to undertake informal resolution. That is exactly what happened to her. And it has long been possible for service personnel to make a complaint outside of the chain of command. For many, many years, they've been able to do it via Marietta's office. And it's always been the case that where your chain of command was directly implicated, the assumption was that they wouldn't be involved. That is not the problem here. The problem is the army are not able to investigate these for themselves. There is an institutional inbuilt tendency to disbelieve women and to leave them in desperate situations. And as a result, they have no faith.
Right.
So it seems to me that there is no alternative now. They're going to have to try this.
Should the police now be called in to investigate these two men, one of whom appears to still be in the army, Marietta?
Unfortunately, not my place to say. I think it is very disappointing that one of them is still in the armed forces, as it is very clear that that behaviour has no place. And had the army dealt with this correctly in the first place, I would have expected to see much stronger action being taken.
I mean, it sort of beggars belief that he's still in the army, isn't it?
It does, yes.
Emma, should the police be called in?
Well, the family would like to see that, yes, and I think they wouldn't want us to comment further on that in case they do. But I think it's really important to note that he was promoted after this happened. He was promoted, and it was only after Jaisley died when the army thought, oh my God, we're going to be asked some really difficult questions here. And he was actually promoted, and he was put in a soldier-facing role. And it was only after she died. Not after she reported the sexual assault, after she died, that he was taken out of that soldier-facing role. And he announced at the inquest that he's leaving the army in the spring, but it's on his own volition, so at his own request.
This is Michael Webber you're talking about.
I am. He's not being forced out. So, I mean, what more do you need them to be... What else can you say to them?
Right. Emma Norton, Marietta Hughes, thank you both very much for joining me.